Hello, everyone. Good morning. Very excited about today's lecture. We're going to be talking about a genre of musical performance that has had a long withstanding history throughout Europe, throughout the world, really. And that is the history of busking and street performance. As always, I have a one-page prepared for today's lecture, which gives you an idea as to what areas we're going to be covering. But before I toggle over to that, I just want to talk about some of the bigger trends that we will be seeing not only in this lecture, but in the other lectures that will follow in this course. So busking and street performance. Just talking a little bit about music in general, there are a couple of major place markers in history in which significant changes were made, and specifically with either the dissemination or performance of music that really shaped the direction of music history. And, thinking back to antiquity, the idea of who was carrying the music traditions at that time, we had two major umbrellas in which music sat. And music was either secular in nature, meaning that it was not bound to religious, or very specifically in the case of the Western European classical canon, the church, right? And then there was sacred music that was definitely used for religious purposes. So when thinking about music history, those secular performances, where we're going to be mostly dealing with music outside of the realm of the church, is going to be something that's not only passed down orally generation to generation, but is going to be a kind of music that is not written down. Music that was written down was only religious music at that time. And that's going to be the case actually for quite a while in music history. And that fact alone really changes our historical survey of music, because of course there was no recording technology in antiquity, or not until the most recent century, not the one that we're currently living in, right? The one previous, did we have the advent of recording technology that was useful to us, especially in regards to music. But the idea then that there was a whole tradition of music that was not written down, that was passed down orally, that we don't know as much about, is going to be a part of our busking and street performance story. So when I'm talking about busking, weirdly enough, this is a term that's fairly well known to me in the English language, but I guess busking is actually a term that's more commonly used in the UK. As someone who has a number of instrumentalist friends, I myself, I'm a composer and a conductor, so I don't make much music myself as a performer, but of course my network involves these individuals that do. They often refer to it as busking and not street performance. But what we're talking about is performance that's being held in a public space in return for what we call gratitudes. And gratitudes change in a number of different contexts. The most common form of gratitude is, of course, moolah, money. But other places, there are other forms of gratitude that are often accepted and desired by street performers, from, food or drink or other sorts of gifts. But, money makes the world go round is obviously commonly accepted in exchange for these other things. So gratitudes most often at this point come in the form of money. So street performers, going back to sort of antiquity, we have a number of old style street performers, that are much more well documented, kind of like from the Middle Ages on. The original, what I call man with a guitar, but in this case, a lute, ended up being an individual known as a troubadour. And this is actually probably a good time to go over to my lecture notes. I'll pepper in my general discussion as we push forward chronologically. This first part is mostly about, sorry, here we go. Mostly about this left-hand side here, dealing with the history of busking and street performance. We'll talk about some of these trends, and we're right here talking about French buskers, the troubadours. So Middle Ages, we're talking 1100 to 1350. And this style of street performance, a performer singing and accompanying himself on a lute was very, very common. It's, like I said, the sort of original singer-songwriter. And thinking about, it's always important to kind of consider why street performance, or why especially older versions of street performance existed. It wasn't just for the sake of public entertainment in a lot of cases. You only have to look at even more recent trends, thinking about, like the USSR and the totalitarian regimes of Hitler, for example, to understand that they knew that music had a particularly potent force as being an element of propaganda, which could work very much in your favor or very much against your favor. And thinking about the against your favor thing, songs were often used as a way of sending a message. And one that often had a political or social commentary to it. A lot of these songs of troubadours talk about current events that are ongoing as a way of passing word about them transpiring in the first place. So consider, put it in the back of your mind a little bit, that street performance and busking has an important social and political angle to it. Occasionally, it's not just something that is done necessarily for the form of entertainment. So folk music is really going to come into play as we talk about the 20th century. But before I go on for too long without actually giving us a musical example to chew on, I want to get us the sound of a troubadour, and obviously historical performance that's done currently. There's no recordings of troubadours of the time, but we can historically recreate some of these songs that were popular throughout Europe, based on some writings that were left on how to construct instruments that were popular at the time, lyrics as well. Someone did at some point jot down a tune or two, although the whether or not it is 100% accurate is, of course, a little left as a mystery. But in any case, let me pull up our first listening example.
Pensi sui fus och en franje mastro man dic fall flac frac perché o volgra cor franche ferm fie fisel ferm alle for car mai merison kai si per car ma britai un sul nu fer en fola tur matur en fer car mai nu tol blu braun nu frain e seu amor per amma par car compri come nutte frac mai per amami sonne for li fa flac perché men ferm. celle qui me fait qu'elle me fit qu'elle me ferme. Mundes fermat cor falsefer, carta ma prim quel crime qu'elle me fragne, a prime l'imper qu'elle s'espère, cap dura dur laureitos frac, sa sac mal crac ni sai cor for, seu leu nu leu el fais trop for, penso que el cor mi fragne, e chi apere fol si per, non ses mes en loc fort ni ferm, perché o ma ferm cor per, el locus ne fac.
So in this case, this is something that's more elaborate than just one singer that is accompanying himself with a lute. But we do hear a strong emphasis on sounds that were well developed at that time. So of all of the instruments that we are acquainted with today, especially ones in the orchestral setting, the string instruments were the first to be perfected. And we often hear string instruments and, of course, percussion instruments. We're not talking about found objects. Obviously, there were a lot of found objects of the everyday that were used in a percussive context that were, predate the creation of stringed instruments, even very simple ones like the monochord by the ancient Greeks. However, this sound is still really typical of the Middle Ages, and the instrumentation here tells us that. We have a underlying pulse that is incredibly consistent. It makes the piece catchy, very inviting to first listeners. And if you were to hear this in a larger market square, you would, of course, be paying money, gratitudes to the performers that were, coloring the space. And while there's no translation of the text here, oftentimes, like I said, the text was an important delivery for political and social messages that were relevant to the communities at this time, a good way of sending word about particular things that were of importance. So, in Europe, this was a trend. Also, any of these instruments that you heard did not have any place in the sacred realm of music. So also interesting that we have an instrumental divide when it comes to whether we're listening to sacred or secular music of this time. In any case, this was happening in Europe. There were, of course, cultures in other locations are going to impact, how music is used, why music is used, and when music is used. And while this is not a comprehensive look at literally every single tradition of busking and street performance, there is a very cool tradition in Japan, thinking a little bit more contemporary and current, that involves a choreographed element of marching in addition to performance and music. So let me go ahead and pull up my lecture notes once more. So in the 19th century Japan, we have this chindonya, which is essentially a Japanese marching band that's usually done in an element of traditional dress, and was used at that time as a way to usually promote the grand opening of a business or draw attention to a particular area of commerce. So I want to pull up an example of what that looks like, because it's a little unlike the busking and street performance traditions that dominate New York, most certainly.
春の夜や女見返る柳橋、江戸の情緒を残す町、巡り巡って散策すれば品の良いもの、うまいもの、老舗のグルメにお土産に何でも揃う柳橋。
楽しくて美味しくて元気になれる町、
柳橋めぐり商店街にいらっしゃいませ。
にブランディックス1でございます
嵐の大固定でございます。
とんかつ100万石でございます柳橋店うまいものこちら千金でございます
ちんどん屋というのは、まず音楽を演奏して街中を練り歩いてで、奇抜な服装をしているわけなんですけど、それで、その通行人かあるいはその辺で、お住まいの方とか働いている人の注目を集めて宣伝をする、何かのメッセージを伝えるっていうのがちんどん屋ですね。大体3人か4人でやっております。ちんどん屋と呼ばれるゆえんでもあるんですけど、ちんどん太鼓っていうのを持ってまして、それはお祭りで使う当たり金と締め太鼓と平釣り太鼓、この3つを組み合わせたものをちんどん太鼓と言ってます。でそれを持ったものと、あとドラムって言ってますけど、大きな、ベースドラム1人、それとサックスソンまたはクラリネットといった3名か4名でやってるわけですね。一番主流の説は幕末なんですよね。その時代は楽器っていうのは別になかったんですよ。その後いろいろあって今の形になったのは、特にクラリネットサクソンが入ってきたのは昭和に入ってからですね。特に戦後ですね。サックスが入ってきたのは戦後ですね。昭和20年代から。
So thinking about the instrumentation here, obviously things are going to change based on globalization, transnational currents, the idea of technology and migration, moving people and spreading ideas and new instruments. So the clarinet and the saxophone here, specifically, European and imports from the West, being mixed with more traditional music of Japan, which going way back to the Edo period, which was discussed, is mostly going to be based in percussive studies. And again, thinking about those troubadour songs, the first instruments, of course, in Japan are also categorically percussion instruments and string instruments that are among the first that are developed. In any case, a very fun tradition of street music and street performance that we don't see here in New York at all, or at least I haven't in my decade plus of living here. There are other trends that are more current, because this tradition was mostly meant as a form of advertising. Advertising happens in a number of other mediums at this point, television, radio, the internet. So this kind of marketing isn't done nearly as often anymore. And so the change of technology and technological currents is also going to have an important impact on the development of music via avenues that we probably don't initially consider. I want to go back to my lecture notes and discuss other more current trends past the 19th century that we see in street performance and busking. Probably one of my favorite things that occurs in the 19th century United States is the idea of a medicine show. And medicine shows were incredibly popular. They were traveling ensembles and were almost circus-like in their characteristics. It's a situation, a medicine show would be a situation in which there would be elixirs that were promised to have, like snake oil, to have magical properties, and promote personal health to some extent. And as a part of these medicine shows, oftentimes there was a performative element in order to help sell the good. That performance was an element of spectacle that was wrapped into the medicine show. shortly on the heels of that, we have the invention of the one-man band, which makes an occurrence in a number of vintage recreations, I suppose, but it's a musical and theatrical spectacle in which one performer is responsible for all of the music making elements that are happening. It's often a performer that has a setup of different instruments that are all rigged together to be controlled by the hand, feet, mouth, harmonica, to singing, to playing the guitar, to operating percussive instruments with the feet and the legs. So these two trends were popular alongside of one another, the one-man band being just a musical event, but medicine shows were also areas in which we heard and saw musical and theatrical spectacle. Let me go ahead and pull up an example of both a medicine show and a one-man band.
It cures all diseases, kills everything. Here's what ails you. Do you have a cough? Hammond's Wizard Oil will help you. Do you have a sore leg? Right this way to the Hammond's Wizard Oil Show. Oh, hey, welcome there. You look like you're full of ails and sores. But we can cure that too right this way. Step right up, step right up. Hamlin's Wizard Oil Show is about to begin. Welcome, people of Lanesboro and Fillmore County. I am Mr. John Hamlin, inventor of Hamlin's Wizard Oil. We are traveling through southern Minnesota to make your lives better with Wizard Oil. Hamlin's Wizard Oil is the medical wonder. There is no sore it will not cure. There is no pain it will not subdue. It is pleasant to take. And its magical effects will be felt on both the men and the beasts. Oh.
Okay, so essentially after this major pitch for the miracle oil, what happens afterwards is a whole barrage of performances that happen kind of in a variety show style. And it's meant to kind of wrap the audience up in a state of wonder and really sell the product. It's another form of extended advertising. So these shows would travel around in the 19th century. If you've seen, I tried to look up the Twilight Zone episode, there's so many of them, that has a traveling medicine show, but you've probably seen this kind of a getup at some point, at least referenced, perhaps in a cartoon, but they were very, very common forms of traveling entertainments that were very kind of circus-like, but also had this, this angle of selling something. I also want to show you an example of a one-man band. And again, this is going to be a more contemporary approach to a one-man band, but something I hope you still find interesting and entertaining. One-man bands not only are used for street performance, but also find their way into studio productions. So let me go ahead and pull up our next example.
Heart got happy, soul got glad. Think about the way you love me too, amigo mio. Yeah, yeah. Bet your life home to you. Oh, baby. Oh, baby. I'm gonna bring it on home to you. Baby, bring it on home to you. Bring it on home to you.
So I played this specifically for this one little thing over here, which is this mechanical monkey. And that mechanical monkey, I hope you have seen in some sort of context. Perhaps in the setting of an iconic street performer playing a what we call a street organ with a what usually is a trained monkey. Now, obviously, for humane reasons, we don't condone having trained monkeys as performers in the United States, but that wasn't always the case. And that mechanical monkey that you saw is a iconic representation from a very bygone era. We'll talk a little bit more about the monkey and this the role that the monkey plays in accepting gratitudes in our next section. But I want to just briefly finish up talking about the last of the historical trends. So let me go ahead and pull up my lecture notes one more time. Okay, so in the 1960s, we have, especially in the Bay Area, which is in California, which is not our focus. This is New York driven discussion, but important to talk about some other trends that were happening in terms of street performance, especially really wildly popular ones. And the counterculture and hippie movement were all about the, part of their approach was about, well, not only free love for all, but using music as a way of promoting that kind of inclusive message. And in the 1960s, there were these things called be-ins, and they were multi-performer festivals in which, you know, different acts would gather in public spaces in return for gratitudes. And in the Bay Area, they often occurred at the Golden Gate Park, which if you have not been, is a beautiful outdoor space, or San Jose's B Stadium. Just to give you an idea of some of the artists that came through and did public performance: Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, especially in and along the 1960s. So street performance and busking has a relationship to popular music. And, you know, thinking about history a little bit, the way that, especially before recording, the way that you were going to get your musical message across was to perform in a public space. So recording and the change of technology in that respect has dramatically decreased the presence of street performance and busking overall. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We've opened up a whole new medium, and one that secures preservation of musical performance or theatrical performance, which is very cool. But that big change has had an impact on the fabric of what kind of street performers we see and experience. We to that extent, perhaps music has taken a back seat in terms of street performance, where other mediums have more public presentation, such as choreographed dance or juggling or other what I call circus arts. And of course, a more current trend with, especially with COVID and lockdown, is this idea of cyberbusking, where artists either live stream or promote their artistry through videos through a number of channels from YouTube and beyond, and take digital gratitudes via PayPal, Venmo, etc. So that's a quick look at some of the historical considerations when it comes to street performance and busking. So it's had a long withstanding history that's very, very interesting to look at. And again, I really just gave you a glossary look at some of these things. When we come back for part 2, we're going to dissect some of the aspects of street performance, what is involved, the idea of taking gratitudes, and the kinds of formats that we experience street performance in. So I will see you for part 2 shortly.